There's breaking news at this hour from Orlando, where there are reports of a shooting at a nightclub.
We've heard so many horrifying stories from inside that nightclub.
How many more of these mass tragedies do we have to live through? This is the worst in American history.
People need protection. They have to protect. So the bad guys will have the assault rifles, and the people trying to protect themselves will be standing there with a BB gun.
And as Americans, we are united in grief, in outrage, and in resolve to defend our people.
My heart goes out to the victims of the Orlando shooting, their friends, and their families. 53 were wounded, 49 died. This was no small tragedy. And as shocking and tragic as it was, it seems to me an even bigger tragedy that it was not a surprise. This was the third mass shooting in the US this year. In 2015, there were 7, up from 4 the previous year. Between 2005 and 2015, there were 43 mass shootings in the United States, compared to only 17 between 1985 and 1995. Point being, this has been happening more and more frequently and will very likely happen again. Steps obviously need to be taken to prevent more tragedies like this, so let's see if we can identify the problems that cause them and how to fix them. But considering how ineffective and corrupt Congress has proven itself of being, it's hard to get major legislative changes in America. So let's start with the basics. What's the least we can do?
I say this every time we've got one of these mass shootings. This just doesn't happen in other countries.
In the US, mass shootings have been on the rise, as have the number of guns in the country. Although interestingly, there are actually fewer and fewer households with guns. So the growing number of guns in the country have actually been concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. In the United States, there are now 112.6 guns per 100 people. And between 2009 and 2015, 89 annual deaths from mass shootings per billion. Let's compare this to some other wealthy Western countries. Now, judging from these numbers, we would expect that the more guns you have in a country, the more mass shootings you'll have. This reflects Obama's remarks that this simply doesn't happen in other countries. Whether or not this really is the case, which we'll get back to in a minute, it seems obvious that one way to prevent or at least mitigate the damage done by mass shootings is gun control. A number of gun control bills have been proposed in Congress and soundly defeated by the NRA and its allies. Some of the most reasonable proposals have included an assault weapons ban, closing gun show and internet sales loopholes, strengthening mental health screening, and banning guns for people on the terrorist watch list. I support all of these measures, but the problem with mass shootings seems to go well beyond just access to guns. If we expand our chart of mass shooting deaths versus number of guns to include a few other wealthy developed Western countries, the picture gets a little more puzzling. While all of these countries have more mass shooting deaths than the US, they have fewer guns, around the number Canada and Germany have. While this data clearly rejects Trump and the NRA's claims that more guns will make you safer,
You had guns on the other side, you wouldn't have had the tragedy that you had. If people in that room
But there
had
was,
guns,
but
with the
Mr. Trump, there was
bullets
an
flying in the
armed
opposite
security
direction,
guard.
it also shows that Obama was incorrect in saying that this doesn't happen in other countries, and the widely believed liberal dogma that fewer guns will mean fewer mass shooting deaths. Unless you're cherry-picking data, there seems to be little relationship between mass shooting deaths and gun prevalence. So if fewer guns does not result in fewer mass shooting deaths, what would? What can explain why countries like Norway and France see high rates, but Germany and the UK see low rates? I'm sorry to say that I can't find a single factor that explains the trend. I've looked at healthcare, population density, diversity, GDP, and the gap between rich and poor. None of these factors map onto the data neatly. So I challenge you to tell me in the comments section if and how you can make sense of it. If you can figure it out, maybe you can identify how to solve the mass shooting problem. To me, the mass shooting data seems almost random, and I think two things can explain this. First, there are too many factors going into what's causing mass shootings to map out easily. The reasons that people decide to do horrible acts are disparate and complicated. The motives mass shooters themselves have pointed to in their manifestos are wide-ranging and include things like experiences being bullied, religious inspiration, social and political aspirations, racial hatred, and feelings of alienation. It's simply too difficult to map out how all of these different factors play out in different countries, especially given the other thing that that I think makes explaining the mass shooting data so difficult, which is that when it comes to mass shootings, huge differences are made by a very small number of people. To have 7 mass shootings in a country, we only need 7 mass murderers willing to commit them. It's very difficult to see how an overall trend in a society of tens or hundreds of millions of people will affect the tiny number of people needed for mass murders to happen. Mass shooters are almost by definition outsiders. So it shouldn't surprise us to find it difficult to explain them in relation to the countries in which they live. I know this is an unsatisfying answer. I wish I could point to a single factor that explains all mass shootings, but I can't. And facts are stubborn things. But as perplexing and seemingly random mass murder data is, overall gun deaths is not so complicated. Here are each of those same countries I talked about in order of guns per person. And here are their firearm-related annual death rates per 100,000. We can see clearly in this chart that the country with by far the fewest guns also has by far the fewest firearm-related deaths. And the country with by far the most guns has by far the most gun-related deaths. The countries with moderate numbers in one category also have moderate numbers in the other. Firearm homicides, by the way, show the exact same pattern. In the US, there have been 3.43 per 100,000 per year, whereas in the UK, there were only 0.06. And Canada, Finland, Switzerland, France, Norway, and Germany all rank in between. And by the way, if we look at overall homicide rates, which includes both gun and non-gun related deaths, the numbers still remain fairly similar. 3.9 per 100,000 per year in the US compared to only 1.0 in the UK, and Finland, Canada, France, Germany, Norway, and Switzerland all rank below the United States. Although it is noteworthy that the UK's tiny rate of guns has not translated into fewer overall murders when compared to other non-US countries. So while it may be difficult to identify a single cause of mass shootings, which makes finding a single solution to the problem, well, impossible, we can see that more guns in a country do result in more firearm-related deaths and firearm-related murders. So while gun control efforts may not have an effect on mass shootings, they would very likely decrease overall gun deaths. And gun-related deaths is no small problem. While in 2015 there were 39 deaths from mass shootings in the United States, there were 12,000 gun-related deaths and 25,000 gun-related injuries. So even if gun control wouldn't stop mass shootings, which appears to be the case, it could still do some good, and in an area that affects far more people. But for Congress to pass even modest gun control legislation, quite a bit of work is needed. In the wake of the Orlando shooting, 4 proposed gun control bills have already been voted down in the Senate. While an earlier vote on the ban of weapons sales to people on the terrorist watch list was split almost entirely along party lines, even Democrats are often not willing to push for gun reform. The NRA is an incredibly effective special interest group, and most politicians are afraid to take them on. So if we want it to happen, voting is not enough. And I think that holds true on virtually any important political issue. If we're looking for change, the ballot box is essential, but insufficient. If we genuinely want a break from business as usual in Washington, we're going to have to stop asking ourselves this question.